Welcome back. It is 9:34 on your Tuesday, this primary Tuesday. We are joined by Dr. David Niven. Thank you so much for coming in. Of course, big day with the primaries going on. Obviously, we're in that mid-cycle. So traditionally, haven't seen a lot of turnout in mid-cycle elections. But in this kind of landscape, do we expect more and more people to come out?
Well, certainly you're right that primaries don't draw as much attention as the general election, and off years don't draw as much as presidential. But, you know, this typical cycle that we see year after year after year is the president's party tends to have bad midterm elections, and this does not appear to be any kind of an exception, you know, with the wins definitely, you know, in the face of the Republicans right now.
And you were saying just in the break, looking at statistics of how many people showed up for the Republican primary 4 years ago. What did you see then, and what are you tracking today?
Well, I think one of the stories that folks aren't really focusing in on as they're thinking about who wins a particular race is just exactly how many folks show up for each party today. And what we saw 4 years ago is the Republicans had twice as many voters as the Democrats in the primary in Ohio. And that was a great harbinger of what was to come 6 months later. There was just more enthusiasm among Republican voters, and there's more Republicans in Ohio than Democrats. Today, one of the things, forget about who wins, for example, the Secretary of State's race, was really critical is how many Democrats show up to vote in that. And I think, you know, what we've seen nationwide, the trend has been high Democratic enthusiasm. And for Ohio Democrats, if they can pull in even today, not who wins, but how many folks show up in the primary, would mean some really promising things for them come November.
To keep that engine going.
To keep that going.
And, you know, I mean, it's always been a safe bet for Republicans that anytime Donald Trump is on the ticket, they get an astronomical turnout. Well, President Trump is not on the ticket because it's a midterm, not a presidential year. And Governor DeWine's not on there either. So for Republicans out there, I mean, I guess really the only to drive them right now is the choice between Casey Poosh and Vivek Ramaswamy. For Democrats, Amy Acton's unopposed. What's going to bring either one to the polls today?
Well, I think really in both parties, it's more of an expression of excitement for the party than for particular candidates. We don't have super high profile primary races. You know, on the Republican side, you know, there's a competitive primary for treasurer. On the Democratic side, there's a competitive primary for Secretary of State. Both of those are really kind of hard and confusing races because both candidates have significant support. You know, they have endorsements from different wings of their party. So, you know, I think more than being driven by the typical high-profile campaign, you know, this is a race that's just about hardcore party supporters. And Republicans will be out there for a Republican ticket, and Democrats will be out there for the Democratic ticket. But here's one thing that I think is super interesting. Any vote against Ramaswamy in the Republican primary is, again, a warning sign. You know, if he, as the universally endorsed Republican candidate, is losing 10, 15, 20%. That's a nervous sign of how many of those folks won't come back in November to vote for him.
Right, unless he changes some policy platform
Well,
issues.
It's just difficult. And part of what's interesting is the party came around him without him ever having won a vote, without him ever having served in office. You know, they just assumed he was a super competent, you know, super candidate. And you know, on the trail, he's really spent a lot of time cleaning up his own statements, you know, and so it's a really interesting example where they went with the least tested product they could come up with and just assumed it would work.
Maybe a good businessman, but maybe not the polished politician that people are used to.
And his presentation is, well, I am a successful businessman. I can certainly run a state. But that doesn't mean you can communicate well with people or connect with people or, you know, even, you know, that you come across, you know, as an Ohioan who cares about Ohio first. He frequently says things, you know, I think last week said something like, you know, Ohio is not the best state in the nation. Well, you don't say that running for governor. You may think that and we may know that, but you don't say it.
And then switching across the aisle over to Dr. Acton, for one side, she worked under a Republican administration. She was director of public health, resigned in 2020. And so for that, for Democrats, they see her as somebody who worked under a Republican administration. Republicans see her as how she handled COVID. Will these issues come back to haunt her come November?
Well, there's certainly a segment of Ohio who would hold 2020 against her. But those are folks who probably would never have voted for any Democrat, regardless of who they were or what their background is. I think for Democrats, the challenge has been they're out of candidates. There's just, forget about a bench. They don't have a starting lineup.
Yeah.
They're out of candidates. And so after Sherrod Brown, and you can only run him for one thing. I mean, if Democrats could, they would have run him for governor, and they would have run him for Senate, and they would have run him for Secretary of State. But you can only run him for one thing. The Democrats desperately need to introduce some new characters to the story, and that's what Amy Acton represents. There aren't the established names in the Democratic Party are retired, or they've taken their lumps. And I think what's exciting about her to Democrats is, she isn't another representation of the exact same candidate they've had so many times before, and they've come up short with so many times before.
So do you feel like, should Vivek win the primary, it'll be Vivek versus Amy Acton? What are we looking at that's going to be the game changer for either candidate now through November? Is it the fundraising? Is it who has the most dollars to put their name out there?
Well, the funny thing about fundraising is you need to have enough money to run a campaign. But past that, dollars don't equal wins. There's no particular upside in terms of winning percentage once you get past that critical sum of money where you can have a staff, where you can be on the air with TV ads and that. So he has money. He can personally fund his campaign, and he's already put $25 million into his campaign, which is really a warning sign that he felt he had to do that. If this campaign were going better, you would just keep the $25
money would be coming in
your pocket.
Yeah.
Exactly. Somebody would be donating. But what I do think, this is probably going to be a national result. If the Democrats stay on top in the polls, and if gas prices stay in the stratosphere, and if dissatisfaction with Trump stays where it is, it's a great situation for Democrats. And the last time they had a good election in Ohio, it's been a while, it was 2006, and that was, again, unpopular Republican president, national wind at their back.
And you mentioned, a key thing right there is cost of living. It's no secret things are expensive. Gas is expensive. The other issue that has really both sides united on one thing is data center growth. Both sides are pushing back on those for different reasons, but united in the pushback against those. Besides the cost of living and that issue, is there any other issue that voters are really trying to back behind a certain candidate on?
Well, I think this is just a classic example of how confusing Ohio politics can be. There's certainly dissatisfaction with property taxes in Ohio, and we're seeing that bubble up in several different ways. And it's one of those odd situations where Republicans, of course, have run as the anti-tax party, but what that has translated into is lowering state income taxes, which has actually contributed to the increase in property taxes. Because when you lower state revenue, that means less money going to your city. Your city still needs police and fire, so they raise property taxes. So it's one of those confusing issues where, if we were to get into the weeds of this, voters would fall asleep pretty quickly, even though they care about the price and the bottom line of it. So that's an Ohio-specific one. Ramaswamy is doing his best to create issues where there weren't issues to begin with. His proposal, for example, to close Ohio universities, I think would be a great example of something that he's created a controversy that didn't exist in the first place. There was no groundswell of people picketing outside Kent State saying, shut your doors.
Yeah. Well, David Niven, thank you so much for joining us, political science professor from University of Cincinnati. You're going to be with 10 TV all day long throughout our evening, including our streaming coverage beginning at 7 p.m. tonight. So bring the coffee.
I will, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for being here.